You're 8 years old. The lights just went out. And even though you know that there's nothing under the bed, your feet still hit the floor running when you get up for water at 2 a.m. Funny thing is, you never grew out of that feeling. You just got better at hiding it. Turn off the lights in a parking garage tonight and watch how fast your walking pace changes. So here's the question nobody really stops to ask. Why does something as harmless as the absence of light still make an adult human's heart rate spike? The answer isn't really about ghosts, or monsters, or bad childhood memories. It goes back further than any of that, hundreds of thousands of years further. And it turns out your fear of the dark might be one of the smartest things your body ever learned to do. Let's start with the obvious explanation, the one you probably already believe. Humans can't see in the dark, so darkness feels dangerous. True, but incomplete. Plenty of animals can't see well at night either, and they don't panic the way we do. So there has to be something more specific going on. And there is. But here's where it gets strange. In 2006, anthropologists Donna, Hart, and Robert Sussman published research reframing how we think about early human evolution. Their argument, laid out in the book Man the Hunted, was blunt. For most of our species' history, we weren't the apex predator strolling the savannah. We were prey. Leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and giant eagles all preyed on early hominins. And the fossil record backs this up. Puncture marks on skulls that match predator teeth almost perfectly. And here's the detail that matters most. Nearly all of that predation happened at night, when big cats have a massive visual advantage over a mostly blind, slow, defenseless primate. Think about what that means. For roughly 2 million years, the individuals who survived long enough to pass on their genes were disproportionately the ones who felt uneasy in the dark and acted on it. The ones who huddled closer to the fire, who startled at rustling leaves, who didn't wander off alone at night just to see what was out there. The anxious ones lived. The calm ones got eaten. That's not a metaphor. That's just how natural selection works. So when your chest tightens walking to your car at night, you're not being irrational. You're running software that's a few 100,000 years old, built by ancestors who tested it in the field, literally. Now here's the part nobody talks about. It's not just that early humans were afraid of the dark. It's that the fear was so useful, it reshaped human behavior on a societal level. Richard Wrangham, a Harvard biological anthropologist, has argued that the controlled use of fire, likely mastered somewhere between 1 million and 400,000 years ago, didn't just give us cooked food and warmth. It gave us protected nighttime. For the first time, a group of hominins could sit in a lit circle, backs to the flame, eyes on the darkness, and actually rest. Fire didn't just change what we ate. It changed how we slept, how we socialized, and some anthropologists argue, how we started telling stories, since the fireside became the first stage humans ever had. That's a wild thought if you sit with it. The campfire ghost story might be one of the oldest human traditions there is, not because we love being scared, but because the dark used to genuinely require a lookout, and stories were how the lookout stayed alert while everyone else calmed down. But wait, what about people who aren't scared of the dark? Plenty of adults sleep like rocks with the lights off. Doesn't that break the theory? Not really. And this is the part that actually strengthens the case. Fear of the dark isn't a switch that's either on or off across the species. It's a dial, and where it sits depends heavily on context. A 2010 study published in the journal Emotion by researchers at the University of Toronto found that fear of the dark peaks predictably in early childhood, right around ages 3 to 6, then gradually fades as children grow more confident their environment is actually safe. In other words, the fear shows up hardest exactly when a human is smallest, weakest, and most defenseless. The same conditions that made darkness genuinely lethal for our ancestors. The kids who cry out for a nightlight aren't being dramatic. They're running the oldest risk assessment software humans have, and it's doing exactly what it evolved to do. Adults who feel unbothered by the dark usually aren't fear-proof. They've just built enough evidence, over years, that their bedroom, their street, their house is safe. Take that same calm adult and drop them alone in an unfamiliar forest at midnight, and watch how quickly that confidence disappears. The fear isn't gone. It's just waiting for the right conditions to switch back on. And the body doesn't only react with vague unease, it reacts specifically and measurably. Here's where it gets a little unsettling. Researchers studying pupil dilation have found that human pupils widen not just in low light, but in response to fear itself, layering an extra biological signal on top of the visual one. Meanwhile, a well-documented body of sleep research shows that cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, tends to spike in people who wake suddenly in a dark, unfamiliar room, even when there's no actual threat present. Your nervous system, in other words, doesn't wait for proof of danger before reacting. Under low visibility, it assumes the worst first and asks questions later. That's not a flaw in the system. That's the entire point of the system. A brain that waited for confirmed danger before reacting would have been a brain that didn't survive to pass itself on. There's also a name for what happens when this ancient alarm system misfires badly. Nyctophobia, a diagnosable and often treatable anxiety disorder distinct from ordinary, mild unease in the dark. Clinical psychologists generally treat it with graded exposure therapy, slowly, safely increasing time spent in low light while the nervous system relearns that the danger isn't there anymore. Which is a strange thing to realize. Therapy for fear of the dark is essentially convincing a Stone Age alarm system that it's allowed to retire. But here's the twist that most people never consider. The fear of darkness didn't stay biological. It went cultural, and it got a lot weirder across wildly different, unconnected societies: ancient Mesopotamia, medieval Europe, pre-colonial West Africa, Japan. You find strikingly similar nighttime folklore: creatures that hunt after dusk, spirits that can't cross firelight, warnings against traveling alone once the sun goes down. Anthropologists studying folklore convergence note that when separate cultures independently invent nearly identical warnings, it's usually a sign of a shared underlying survival pressure, not coincidence. The wolf at the door, the demon in the woods, the thing that only comes out at night. Different costumes, same warning label, worn by every human culture that ever had to survive an actual dark. Which brings us to the moment that ties this all together. A child afraid of the dark is not imagining danger. A child afraid of the dark is remembering it. A species that huddled by firelight for 1,000,000 years does not simply forget what the dark once cost it. A species that buried its dead with lit candles, that built street lamps before it built running water in some cities, that still, after all this time, flinches at a sound in an unlit room, is not broken. It is remembering. It is a species carrying its oldest lesson in its chest, still quietly every single night. That's the part that should actually change how you think about your own fear. It's not weakness, it's inheritance. So what do we do with an ancient survival tool in a modern world that mostly doesn't need it anymore? For most of us, the streets are lit, the doors lock, the leopards are gone, and yet the fear persists because evolution doesn't update its software just because the threat retired. It's the same reason we crave sugar and fat in a world with grocery stores on every corner. The environment changed a lot faster than our biology did. Some researchers actually argue this mismatch is worth paying attention to, not fighting. A 2019 review in Evolutionary Psychology suggested that many so-called irrational fears, heights, spiders, the dark, are best understood not as malfunctions but as smoke detectors that are deliberately overtuned, because the cost of a false alarm is a few seconds of discomfort, while the cost of a missed real threat, historically, was death. A smoke detector that goes off from burnt toast is annoying. A smoke detector that fails to go off during an actual fire is fatal. Given that trade-off, evolution built the alarm to be a little too sensitive on purpose, which means the next time your pulse jumps at a dark hallway, you're not glitching, you're not being childish. You're carrying a warning label written by every ancestor who almost didn't make it, and chose in that moment to be careful instead of brave. So picture that 8-year-old again, feet hitting the floor, heart pounding over nothing but shadow and silence. Except now you know what that sprint actually is. It's not fear for no reason. It's a message relayed across roughly 10,000 generations from ancestors who listened to that exact feeling and lived long enough to have children, who eventually had you. You don't fear the dark because something's wrong with you. You fear the dark because, for almost the entirety of human history, that fear was the only thing standing between your bloodline and a pair of eyes shining back at you from the tree line. The lights didn't create the fear. They just gave it somewhere to hide.